The red line moment. What changed today? The phrase racing across screens today is blunt and alarming. Red line crossed. It carries the weight of tanks rolling and missiles launching, but that is not what has been confirmed. As of now, there is no official statement from the United States acknowledging a traditional military seizure of American oil assets by Russia. That distinction matters because words create realities long before facts catch up. What reporting does suggest, according to shipping analysts and early media accounts, is something narrower and more technical. Interdictions, detentions, or assertions of port authority control involving oil shipments with U.S. links. That is not war, but it is not nothing. It sits in a dangerous gray zone where power is exercised without the clarity of formal declaration. This is where skepticism matters. George Will once warned that sloppy language produces sloppy thinking, and sloppy thinking produces irreversible consequences. Calling this a capture may feel emotionally accurate, but legally and politically, it changes the stakes instantly. The real tension today is not battlefield escalation. It is whether raw power can be asserted faster than accountability mechanisms can respond. And that imbalance is where the story actually begins. And the implications are still unfolding now. What the headlines say versus what's actually verified. The loudest version of this story is also the simplest. Russia captured a U.S. oil fleet. It's clean, it's dramatic, and it spreads fast. But when you slow it down and examine what is actually being reported, that clarity begins to dissolve. There is no single, unified claim backed by official confirmation. Instead, there are fragments, interpretations, and assumptions layered on top of one another. One version circulating online suggests American-owned ships were seized outright. Another implies U.S.-insured tankers were detained. Others refer more vaguely to U.S.-linked oil shipments without specifying ownership, flag, or legal jurisdiction. These distinctions are not technical distractions. They are the difference between a geopolitical crisis and a commercial dispute. Modern oil shipping rarely fits into neat national boxes. A vessel may be owned by one entity, insured by another, flagged under a third country, and carrying oil sold through multinational contracts. Flags of convenience and layered ownership structures are not loopholes. They are the norm. And they create precisely the kind of ambiguity that makes rapid escalation narratives possible. That is why responsible framing matters. Phrases like, according to reports, as described by analysts, and pending verification are not hedges. They are safeguards against misinformation hardening into belief. Right now, much remains unknown. The legal basis asserted, the duration of detentions, and the scope of affected shipments. Ambiguity fills the silence where facts should be, and silence in moments like this is rarely interpreted as neutral. If this were a clean-cut seizure, the responses would already be formal and unmistakable. Instead, what we are watching is uncertainty spreading faster than confirmation. And that unresolved gap between perception and proof is exactly why it feels to so many like a line has already been crossed anyway. The legal gray zone seizure, detention, or enforcement. The danger in moments like this is that legal language gets flattened into headlines and nuance disappears. In international law, seizure, detention, impoundment, and sanctions enforcement are not interchangeable terms. A seizure implies a permanent taking of property under asserted authority. Detention suggests temporary restriction pending review. Impoundment often operates through port or customs mechanisms. Sanctions enforcement relies on regulatory power, not military force. Each carries different legal consequences. Russia has increasingly operated inside these distinctions. By invoking port authority rules, customs inspections, or compliance reviews, the state can exert control over vessels without formally declaring hostile intent. It is a strategy designed to apply pressure while avoiding the legal threshold that would automatically trigger international retaliation. From the outside, the impact can feel identical to seizure, even when the legal classification is carefully narrower. International maritime law, however, is built on expectations of free navigation, proportional enforcement, and transparent justification. Detaining commercial vessels without clear legal grounds raises immediate concerns under those frameworks. But concern is not the same as violation, and that gap matters. For an act to legally qualify as aggression, it must cross defined thresholds: force, permanence, and intent. Interdiction under asserted domestic law, even if controversial, often stops just short of that line. This gray zone is not accidental. Ambiguity benefits the actor asserting power because it fractures response. Governments hesitate while lawyers analyze. Institutions debate jurisdiction. Allies wait for clarity that never fully arrives. Meanwhile, control is already being exercised. Legal uncertainty delays accountability, and delay is itself a form of leverage. The longer definitions remain disputed, the harder unified action becomes. That delay shapes public perception as much as policy because uncertainty invites speculation, and speculation pressures leaders to react before the legal foundation is settled or the full scope of authority has been tested in court internationally. And when law becomes blurry, power fills the gap. What matters next is whether this is an exception or part of a larger pattern beginning to reveal itself. This isn't isolated pattern recognition in energy pressure. This moment only feels unprecedented if it's viewed in isolation. When placed against the last decade of geopolitical behavior, it begins to look familiar. Energy has repeatedly been used not merely as a resource, but as leverage. From pipeline disputes to shipping slowdowns to regulatory pressure on transit routes, control over energy movement has become a quiet instrument of influence. What's changed is not the tactic, but the precision. Energy routes are now pressure points. Tankers, ports, insurers, and customs authorities form a web where disruption can occur without a single shot fired. A delay here, an inspection there, and suddenly supply chains tighten, prices move, and political attention snaps into focus. The commodity itself becomes secondary to the signal being sent. This strategy thrives on enforcement by ambiguity. By operating just inside asserted legal authority, states avoid the kind of direct retaliation that clear violations invite. There is no dramatic moment to respond to, no unmistakable act of force. Instead, there is friction, confusion, and deniability. History offers parallels. Similar tactics have been used to test maritime boundaries, airspace tolerance, and trade compliance, always probing where resistance hardens and where it dissolves. Escalation in this framework doesn't look like tanks crossing borders. It looks like paperwork, delays, and procedural justifications layered over political intent. That subtlety is precisely what makes it effective. Each incident can be explained away on its own terms even as the cumulative pressure grows. Seen this way, today's reports resemble less a final move and more a calibration exercise. A test of how much control can be asserted before consequences follow, a measurement of how quickly institutions react, how unified allies remain, and how much uncertainty the public will tolerate before demanding action. These moments accumulate quietly, reshaping norms over time. The danger is not any single incident, but normalization. When pressure tactics succeed without consequence, they invite repetition, refinement, and expansion into broader arenas where the stakes continue rising globally speaking. Power versus accountability. Why the system struggles. Here, the frustration many people feel in moments like this is understandable. If a powerful state can interfere with energy shipments, why isn't there an immediate forceful response? The answer is not cowardice or corruption, it is structure. International bodies are deliberately slow because speed without consensus often creates escalation rather than resolution. Maritime disputes move through layers of verification, jurisdiction, and diplomacy. Evidence must be established. Authority must be clarified. Allies must align. That process is tedious by design because legitimacy depends on shared agreement, not unilateral reaction. The same is true for sanctions enforcement. Sanctions are not enforced by armies. They are enforced by banks, insurers, port authorities, and regulators who must act in coordination to be effective. Plausible deniability weakens accountability because it fractures responsibility. When actions are framed as inspections, compliance checks, or domestic enforcement, it becomes harder to prove intent, harder to assign blame, harder to trigger consequences that require clear violations of law. This is where power exploits process, not by breaking rules openly, but by bending them just enough to stall response. Public expectations, however, are shaped by visible strength. People expect statements, deadlines, consequences. When those do not appear immediately, silence is mistaken for weakness. In reality, silence is often strategic. Governments choose restraint while options are evaluated precisely because premature escalation can close off legal remedies and diplomatic leverage. Accountability rarely announces itself with spectacle. It works quietly through filings, pressure campaigns, and incremental constraint. That makes it unsatisfying to watch, especially in moments charged with emotion. But restraint is not absence, it is preparation. And the gap between what the public sees and what institutions are doing behind closed doors is where distrust grows. That gap creates space for overreaction as well as manipulation. Commentators rush to fill airtime, social feeds amplify fragments, and speculation hardens into assumed truth. Institutions know this, yet cannot shortcut process without undermining legitimacy. Every premature statement carries legal cost later, so restraint persists, even as anxiety rises. The system's weakness is not indifference, but exposure to misinterpretation. And misinterpretation, once widespread, becomes pressure itself, shaping decisions before facts are settled, or accountability mechanisms have fully engaged. This dynamic rewards delay, confusion, and strategic patience more than transparency or immediate moral clarity. When accountability lags, the public fills the silence, and that creates its own risks. The information war layer. While language is the battlefield, words are not neutral in moments of geopolitical stress. The difference between detained and captured is not semantic, it is psychological. Captured implies force, intent, and humiliation. It activates fear, anger, and demands for retaliation. Once that word takes hold, it reframes every subsequent fact through the lens of conflict, even if the underlying action remains legally unresolved. Ambiguity thrives in fragmented media environments. Partisan outlets emphasize whichever interpretation best serves their narrative, while alternative media ecosystems often reward escalation over verification. Each retelling sharpens the edge, stripping away qualifiers until uncertainty sounds like certainty. What begins as reports suggest quietly becomes "this happened," repeated often enough to feel indisputable. This process is accelerated by deep distrust in mainstream institutions. When official statements are slow or carefully worded, they are read not as caution but concealment. Silence becomes suspect. Complexity becomes evasive. Into that vacuum rush influencers, commentators, and anonymous accounts offering confidence instead of accuracy. Confidence travels faster. Responsible political commentary sits uncomfortably in this environment. It requires resisting the emotional pull of certainty while acknowledging why people feel unsettled. Skepticism is healthy, panic is not. The line between the two is crossed when language outruns evidence. At that point, commentary stops explaining reality and starts manufacturing it. Narrative escalation often precedes real-world escalation because leaders respond to perceived public demand as much as to facts. When language hardens into belief, policy options narrow. De-escalation begins to look like surrender. Accountability mechanisms are pressured before they are ready. History shows that once rhetoric locks in, reversing course becomes politically costly, even if new information emerges. That is why this layer matters as much as ships and ports. The battlefield is not only physical or legal, it is linguistic. How this story is told will shape what responses become possible next, and which ones quietly disappear before they are ever considered. This moment tests whether discipline in language can slow escalation, or whether speed and outrage will once again decide outcomes before accountability frameworks even have time to engage. Consequences map what this could trigger. Moments like this matter because they open doors, not because they guarantee outcomes. The first set of consequences sits in the political arena. Diplomatic escalation does not require military action. It begins with statements, reciprocal inspections, expulsions, and symbolic retaliation. Each step narrows room for compromise while signaling resolve to domestic audiences. Even restrained responses, once public, harden positions and make de-escalation politically expensive. Legal consequences follow more quietly but often last longer. Disputed detentions can move into arbitration, sanctions compliance reviews, and court challenges that reshape enforcement norms. If authorities determine that thresholds were crossed, sanctions may tighten incrementally rather than dramatically. Asset freezes, insurance exclusions, and regulatory barriers operate slowly, but they accumulate pressure over time. None of this happens overnight, yet once initiated, it is difficult to reverse without formal resolution. Economic consequences emerge fastest, even before facts are settled. Insurance premiums rise on perceived risk alone. Shipping routes adjust preemptively. Energy markets price uncertainty aggressively, amplifying volatility beyond the physical disruption itself. These reactions are not judgments of legality. They are defensive reflexes by actors who cannot afford to wait for clarity. Then there is the consequence that erodes everything else: public trust. When information is fragmented and official messaging cautious, credibility gaps widen. Rumors gain authority simply by repetition. People choose narratives that align with their fears or expectations, and those narratives begin to shape political pressure. Once trust fractures, even accurate updates struggle to regain traction. None of these outcomes are certain. Each exists on a spectrum of probability that shifts as verification emerges. Clear evidence, transparent legal justification, or credible third-party assessment could de-escalate multiple pathways at once. Conversely, confirmation of overreach would accelerate nearly all of them simultaneously. What matters now is not prediction but recognition. These consequences do not arrive suddenly. They unfold as reactions to signals. Understanding the map helps explain why restraint and precision remain essential, even when emotions demand immediacy. This is why institutions weigh timing so carefully. Early declarations lock governments into paths that may not survive scrutiny. Delay, frustrating as it feels, preserves options while facts mature. The next signals to watch will determine which consequences advance and which recede. Until then, probability remains fluid, not fixed, shaped by verification, restraint, and the discipline to respond to reality rather than headlines. That discipline will decide whether accountability clarifies events or confusion continues dominating public reaction globally. The moral frame. Why accountability still matters. This moment feels unsettling because it exposes a tension many people sense but rarely articulate. We are conditioned to equate strength with speed, volume, and visible reaction. When those signals are absent, it feels like failure. But accountability is not performance, it is restraint enforced by process, and process is designed to hold under pressure, not satisfy emotion. Rule-based order does not announce itself with spectacle. It works through verification, jurisdiction, and proportion. Strength theatrics promise clarity but often deliver chaos. Process promises frustration, but it preserves legitimacy. That difference matters precisely when stakes are high and facts are incomplete. It is understandable to feel uneasy watching institutions move carefully while power appears to act decisively. That discomfort is real. It comes from living in systems where accountability is slower than force. Yet vigilance matters more than outrage. Outrage burns quickly and leaves little behind. Vigilance watches, documents, and waits for thresholds to be crossed before consequences are triggered. Waiting for verified facts is not passivity. It is a moral choice to avoid becoming an accelerant. Every premature conclusion narrows future options. Every exaggerated claim pressures leaders to respond to narratives rather than reality. Accountability requires discipline from the public as much as from institutions. This is why accountability often feels invisible until it isn't. It accumulates quietly through records, precedents, and constraints. When it finally manifests, it does so with weight that cannot be dismissed as theater. The slow pace is not a flaw, it is a filter that separates provocation from proof. This story is not about panic or paralysis. It is about whether systems built to restrain power can still function when tested. That question does not resolve in a single day or headline. It unfolds through decisions made under pressure, when restraint is hardest to maintain and easiest to abandon. What comes next will reveal whether accountability bends, breaks, or quietly asserts itself through process, leaving judgment suspended until facts, not fear, determine the direction forward for institutions, leaders, and publics watching closely now everywhere today. As this chapter closes, clarity matters more than certainty. What is confirmed remains limited. Reports of detentions or port controls involving oil shipments with U.S. links, and no official declaration of a military seizure. What remains unresolved is equally important: the legal basis asserted, the duration and scope of restrictions, and whether international standards have been breached. The next signals will not come from social media. They will appear in filings, formal statements, insurance advisories, and shipping data. Watch for coordinated language between governments, not isolated remarks. Watch whether insurers reclassify risk, whether routes quietly change, and whether arbitration or sanctions reviews are initiated. These moves signal seriousness far more reliably than headlines. Resist the urge to treat early narratives as conclusions. Headlines compress complexity into urgency, but urgency without accuracy distorts judgment. Premature conclusions harden positions and make correction politically costly once new facts emerge. The core takeaway remains steady. Accountability rarely moves at the speed of outrage, but it does move. It advances through documentation, alignment, and cumulative constraint. When it arrives, it carries legitimacy that spectacle never can. Staying engaged does not mean staying inflamed. It means tracking process, noticing shifts in tone and policy, and understanding that restraint today preserves options tomorrow. This story is unfinished, not because nothing is happening, but because the mechanisms that matter operate deliberately. That deliberateness frustrates audiences trained on immediacy, yet it is precisely how durable outcomes are built, tested, and defended over time, especially when competing powers attempt to rush decisions before accountability frameworks can fully activate under sustained geopolitical pressure and intense public scrutiny worldwide. This moment will define whether language drives outcomes or whether process reasserts control. This story isn't over, it's entering its next phase. Watch what happens when rhetoric meets process and process refuses to blink.